The Stolen Dead, Part 1. Kirsteen Williamson was a remarkable woman in more ways than one. Most people know of her rags to riches life story, of how a troubled young girl from an impoverished background in Luton became one of the most acclaimed singer-songwriters of her generation. Find me a female or a British singer of the past 30 years who hasn't been inspired by her in some way. From Amy Winehouse to Paloma Faith, her fingerprints can be found on so many great artists' music. Sadly, we also all know how Kirsteen, like so many other great talents before her, succumbed to drugs, alcohol, and depression, and eventually vanished mysteriously into the night on the 30th of November in the year 1989. There was even a widespread conspiracy theory that she had been abducted by aliens. Ironically, however, very few people know of Kirsteen's greatest accomplishments, her journeys through time and space, her battles with the undead, and her encounter with the creator of all things. This is the true story of Kirsteen Williamson and of the incredible man who made all of this possible for her, Professor Fang. It's hard to imagine a time when Kirsteen wasn't so utterly beloved. You'd be hard-pushed to find anyone who had a bad word to say about her nowadays, either professionally or personally. Her albums are still bestsellers, and according to all who ever worked with her, she was the loveliest woman. There have been countless books, documentaries, and even a really crappy film made about her life. A Star Vanishes into the Night, which was released in 1997, was the usual sensationalised nonsense that films about the lives of dead celebrities almost always are. But, ironically, the thing that it was most widely ridiculed for, the ending where Kirsteen is abducted by aliens, is actually closer to the truth than people know. In 1989, Kirsteen was at the very bottom of her fame and personal life. Her last album had been released in 1984 and hadn't exactly been her greatest work. Even today, whilst not as badly thought of as it was at the time, it's still looked on as being a somewhat unspectacular end to a once glittering career. Furthermore, Kirsteen had become a laughingstock around the world. Her personal problems had spiralled out of control to the point that they had completely eclipsed all of her musical accomplishments. Worse than any of that, however, was the fact that Kirsteen's friends and family had all either passed on or abandoned her. Kirsteen's mother had died when she was just 3 years old, and so she was raised by her father and older brother. She grew up as a bit of a tomboy and was very popular at her school with the boys as a result. In her teen years, she often hung around with a rough crowd, got into trouble regularly, and was eventually expelled at the age of 17 for smoking dope. Music had been the young Kirsteen's salvation. She had always had an interest in it, but it was only after being kicked out of school with virtually no qualifications that she turned to music as a way of earning her keep. Kirsteen played around clubs and pubs for years, until she scored her first big break at the age of just 24 in 1970, after she was spotted by a record manager during one of her performances. She'd go on to dominate the charts for the next 10 years or so, becoming a sensation to rival the Beatles themselves. Sadly, however, it was in 1979 that her life spiralled out of control. Kirsteen had not touched drugs or booze since she was a teenage girl. Her father had convinced her not to after she was booted from school. But, sadly, when Kirsteen's father and brother were both killed in a car accident, she fell back into both habits quite fast. Her marriage ended due to her drug use. She made a complete fool of herself in several interviews and soon became better known for her antics. She also lost most of her fortune due to being betrayed by her agent, who took advantage of the poor woman during her lowest ebb. By 1989, Kirsteen was living alone in a small, run-down house in the middle of London. Kirsteen did eventually get clear in 1987, hoping that she could perhaps rebuild her life and career. But sadly, neither the public nor her former friends were interested anymore. Many of her so-called friends had never really cared for Kirsteen anyway. Much like her worthless husband, they were only there for her when she was a global sensation. She didn't think her life could get any worse and spent hours every day thinking about the people she'd lost or who had walked out on her, and sometimes Kirsteen would be tempted to drink as a result. Still, she always held back, as she was determined that she was going to prove the people who abandoned her wrong. Kirsteen was finally given a chance for a fresh start under the most unusual circumstances when, on the 30th of November, her neighbourhood was visited by a craft from another world. The ship, which was massive and triangular-shaped, suddenly appeared out of nowhere, covering around all of the houses in the neighbourhood in the process. It arrived at 3 o'clock in the morning, when everyone was asleep, and was there for barely over a minute before vanishing once again. Still, the buzzing noise the craft made woke up one of Kirsteen's neighbours, Dave, who was naturally dismissed as a crackpot. In spite of the ridicule, he would insist for the rest of his life that Kirsteen had been abducted by aliens. Kirsteen herself was sound asleep when the ship hovered above her house and teleported her on board. When she awoke several hours later in a large, cold, dark room, her first thoughts were that she must have given in to temptation last night and drank and made a fool of herself to the point where she had been lifted. Not again, she said to herself. So much for proving she had left this behind her. However, as Kirsteen looked around, she noticed that this was not like any prison or police station she had ever been in before, and she'd been in quite a few. It was so dark she could hardly see anything. But at the very end of the room, Kirsteen was able to make out what looked like a door that had been left open. Leaving wasn't an option, as she was in enough trouble for whatever must have happened when she was drunk last night, Kirsteen assumed. Still, as time went on, it became intolerable. Not knowing what she did last night was absolute hell. Kirsteen went up to the door and shouted out for a policeman. There was no answer. She shouted again, but this time she heard a screaming sound. She was scared. Had the criminals overrun the station, perhaps? Why else would the door be left open? I can't just wait here until some crazy person decides to pick me off, she thought to herself. And she slowly and quietly crept out of the room, scared at what would be on the other side. What Kirsteen saw beyond the door was a long, very dark corridor with metallic purple walls. There was also a foul stench in the air too. It smelled like rotting meat and was quite overwhelming. At the other end of the corridor, meanwhile, Kirsteen could also see what looked like a shambling, shaggy figure come staggering round the corner. It was moaning and screaming. He must be on drugs, Kirsteen thought to herself, as she slowly backed away down the other end of the corridor. Just then, however, the figure spotted Kirsteen and, like a bolt of lightning, it sped towards her. As the figure drew closer, Kirsteen could see that its face was horribly disfigured. The flesh, which was bright green, was rotting and even hanging from its face in certain parts. The expression on its face appeared to be a combination of anger and agony. Kirsteen ran as fast as she could down the corridor, not wanting to be cornered in the room she had arrived in, but the beast caught up to her in no time and threw Kirsteen violently to the ground. As Kirsteen struggled to get back up, she could hear the monster speaking in a voice that was deep and booming, yet surprisingly clear. "I will save you," the creature bellowed as it tried to reach down to try and strangle her. Kirsteen could just see ahead of her a door that led into what looked like a small, cramped bedroom. It didn't look like the most secure shelter, but it was better than nothing. If she tried to run back where she came, the monster would surely catch her, and the other end of the corridor looked like it would never end. She jumped up and ran as fast as she could to the room. The creature followed her, and before Kirsteen could shut the door, the monster managed to ram its full body against it. Kirsteen struggled to try and push the beast back, but its strength was far too great. Eventually, it pushed her back until she landed on the floor beside the bed in the centre of the room. Kirsteen, however, didn't give up. She scrambled to her feet and fetched for anything she could use in the room as a weapon. As she looked around, she saw, much to her horror, the corpse of a young woman lying on the bed in the middle of the room, with a knife covered in blood lying next to her. There was also blood dripping from the corpse's mouth. She looked as though she had died very recently. "Foolish girl! She thought she'd escape that way. She will now join us. I'll make sure you don't," the figure said to Kirsteen. Kirsteen reached for a vase that was on a small cupboard behind her. She threw it at the creature, but it did little to deter him. Desperate, Kirsteen then reached for the knife on the bed and started slashing at the monster that was now holding her in its rotting, stinking hands. Kirsteen slashed and stabbed at the zombie's eyes, its throat and its hands. Its strength was unlike anything she had ever felt before, and she could feel her arm that it was clutching slowly starting to break. Still, she fought and hacked at the monster's hand that was grabbing her until she cut it off. Though the creature possessed great strength, its flesh was still rotting and somehow putrid and weak. Kirsteen then stabbed the monster in the heart and pushed it out of the door, which she then shut, though she had to give up the knife in the process. The abomination then started to slam at the door with its single hand, and Kirsteen knew that it would get through in no time. She searched around for another way out, but all she could see was what looked like a ventilation system at the other end of the room. As she went towards it, however, the corpse on the bed suddenly rose up. Kirsteen screamed and ran back to the other end of the room, but there was nowhere to run. The zombie, monster, or whatever it was that she had pushed out into the hall, had already smashed the door down with its single remaining hand. Trapped between two undead, ravenous creatures, Kirsteen pulled the knife out of the male zombie's chest and ran towards the ventilation system. The female zombie reached out and grabbed her, but Kirsteen hacked at its fingers to such an extent that she cut them off too. Kirsteen then jumped onto the bed and from there into the ventilation system. Again, the female zombie latched onto Kirsteen's foot with its other hand. She couldn't reach down with her knife, however, and so, instead, Kirsteen struggled, eventually being able to pull her foot out of her shoe that the monster held. Crawling through the vents, Kirsteen did not even know where she was going. The two zombies, meanwhile, had crawled up after her, but she had a good head start on them. Unfortunately, at the other end of the vent, another zombie crawled out of the darkness in front of her. The way ahead was so dark that Kirsteen didn't even see it at first. She hadn't made that much noise crawling into the vents, but those creatures could sense her very soul. As she couldn't get back, Kirsteen instead started to hit the grate in front of her with her knife to try and break it. She could see in the dark corridor below, however, more creatures were shuffling around aimlessly. There were at least 7 of them. There's no way she could fight the monsters off. The only option was to outrun them, but she couldn't do that either. Still, she kept hacking and stabbing at the grate. But sadly, the former singer wasn't fast enough, and the 2 zombies from either side grabbed her arms and started pulling. Kirsteen felt like her arms were being pulled out of their sockets as she struggled against the inhuman strength of the zombies. Just when all seemed lost for Kirsteen, the grate suddenly opened, and the 2 zombies stopped and stared down at the figure that had pulled the grate out with its bare hands. It was an old, somewhat frail-looking Chinese man. He had long, flowing white hair, a thick white moustache, and was dressed entirely in black. He also wore a black cape and carried what looked like a stick made entirely of gold that, in contrast to the rest of his drab image, was glowing. He reached in for Kirsteen, who was too weak to fight back, and pulled her onto the ground. The zombies followed, but with 2 smacks of his stick to their throats, the mysterious stranger sent the undead brutes crashing to the ground. The old man then hoisted Kirsteen up. "Come on, there's too many of them. We need to get somewhere safe," he said. His voice was strong and commanding, and Kirsteen for some reason felt safe with him, for the moment at least. Using his stick, he battled the other zombies away as he and Kirsteen made their way down the corridor ahead. But when they turned a corner, they came across 8 more zombies. "Where the hell did they come from?" the old man said angrily. He searched around for anywhere to escape to. "Cover your eyes," the old man warned Kirsteen as he held his cane up. A bright flash appeared at the top of the cane, which sent the zombies fleeing. The old man then ran through the mass of zombies with Kirsteen behind him. As the undead were dazed, batting more of them away with his cane was an easy task. At the other end of the corridor were 2 doors, but as the old man made his way to open them, suddenly a rotting clawed hand came smashing through one of the 2 doors. And ripped the door off its hinges, and the figure that was responsible then emerged. It stood roughly 8 feet tall. Kirsteen couldn't quite make it out at first, but when it stepped into the light, she could see one half of its face was completely burned off. The other side of its face was covered in deep scars meanwhile, whilst its clothes were ragged, and its body was covered in horrific wounds. The monster let out a roar, and the old man instantly ran back the way through the zombies, pulling Kirsteen behind him. The monster let out a roar, and the old man instantly ran back the way through the zombies, pulling Kirsteen behind him. The zombies had recovered and surrounded both of them. All seemed lost, as Kirsteen and the old man were trapped between several horrific, ravenous monsters. As the monsters reached out to try and tear their victims apart, the old man, with a wave of his hands, suddenly appeared to hold the zombies back, but it was obviously a great struggle for him, and within a minute he collapsed onto the ground. The largest zombie that had come smashing through the door meanwhile, to the old man and Kirsteen's surprise, started to attack the other creatures. It pulled a short female zombie up off the ground by her hair and then placed its hand on her shoulder and pushed down hard, tearing her head off. 2 of the other zombies turned their attention to the giant, but they were effortlessly torn to pieces by the larger creature. The other zombies wisely started to flee, with the larger brute chasing them, which ironically allowed Kirsteen and the old man to escape by the corridor the giant had come down. At the end of the corridor was a dead end. "No, it can't be!" the old man screamed in frustration. Kirsteen saw that a few of the old zombies the larger one had missed were coming back their way. Kirsteen prepared to try and run past the monsters, but the old man held her back. "Trust me, you won't make it. Get behind me," he said, as he raised his cane in defence. Just then, a blue circle started to appear a few feet away from them. "Quick, get in!" the old man shouted as he jumped into the circle. With no other choice, Kirsteen followed him, and within a few seconds she suddenly found herself in a large, brightly lit room. There was a massive bookcase on the left-hand wall next to her, and a 20-inch TV screen, and some recliner chairs behind. In the very centre of the room, a massive gold chandelier hung from the ceiling. On the opposite side from the TV were 2 huge wooden doors, whilst on the side opposite the bookcase was a large dining area, fit with a 20-foot-long table and a small kitchen behind it. There were about 7 scared-looking people huddled together over the table. One of them, an old man, was constantly downing shots of whiskey. They all looked as though they had come from different eras. The youngest boy at the back looked like a street urchin from Victorian times, whilst another appeared to be dressed in an old-fashioned uniform, possibly from the Second World War. At the back of the table was a young, attractive woman with long dark hair who appeared to be separate from the others. She looked less confused and disorientated, and was holding a strange device. This woman rushed towards the old man as soon as he arrived. "I'm so sorry, Professor. I had to temporarily get rid of the portal. The magic was fluctuating after the crash, and I had to reserve power. It was—" she said, only for the Professor to cut her off. "That's quite all right, Lindsey. I understand. The important thing is that we got the last survivor. Now we can get out of here," he replied. "Excuse me," Kirsteen shouted. "Can someone please tell me what the fuck is going on here? Am I on drugs again? Are you lot hallucinations?" Lindsey approached Kirsteen and spoke gently. Her voice had just a hint of a Scottish accent. "Don't worry. We're here to help you. You've been abducted by aliens. That ship my friend here, Professor Fang, rescued you from. It collided with ours. We're not sure who created it yet, but it does appear to run on magic." One of the people at the back suddenly piped up, a young woman in her 20s named Jenna. "Hang on a minute. She looks like Kirsteen Williamson." "She very well could be," Professor Fang said, as he tinkered with some device by the wall. In contrast, he had a strange, unknown accent. It made sense after all, as he had lived for hundreds of thousands of years on just about every corner of the earth. "But that's impossible. The woman said. "So?" The professor cut her off before she could reveal what happened to Kirsteen. "I told you, I haven't had time to check on what era we're in. But we could very well be 30 years in the past, or 1,000, or we could be in another universe altogether. Most of you are from different times. Still, if you'll give me a few minutes, we can find out where we are," he continued, somewhat impatiently. Kirsteen was deeply disturbed by this conversation and begged Lindsey to let her go. There was something about Lindsey that seemed non-malicious. Even in this strange environment, Kirsteen didn't feel threatened by her. Whilst she felt the professor wasn't evil, there was still something a little unsettling about him. "Please, we don't really know what's going on either, but we're doing the best we can. Just trust us. You're safe here," Lindsey assured Kirsteen. The others started to protest, but Fang soon shut them down by slamming his stick on the table. "I don't like any of you being here either. This is my home, and I'm normally very picky about who I invite over for tea. Still, we all have to stick together for the time being. Not all of you were lucky enough to get this far, or need I remind you?" the professor shouted furiously. A deathly silence fell over the room. "Exactly. Now please give us some peace while we try and get you all out of this situation," he continued. After Fang and Lindsey left the room, Kirsteen went over to the table. The people almost didn't pay attention to her. They were so wrapped up in their own problems. In the distance, Kirsteen thought she could see what looked like a hideous, demonic face appearing on the wall at the opposite end of the room from the TV. The face looked as though it was part of the wall at first, but then it started to move. Kirsteen screamed and tried to alert the others to it, but by the time they looked around, the face was gone. "So," Kirsteen said, somewhat awkwardly, "any chance any of you could tell me who, or rather what, took us here?" Only one of them answered Kirsteen, the old man that had been drinking the whiskey, who was dressed in somewhat tattered clothes. "None of us know. We're all from different times, it would seem, like the old geezer says. I'm from the age of Taros. There I was in the middle of the fight of my life with the vampire scum Maleska and his pet Tyrannosaurus, when suddenly I was in a tiny little room with several rotting corpses pounding on my door." "I'm sorry, did you say vampire?" Kirsteen asked. "I can only assume you come from a time before their filth covers our entire world. I'm convinced the man who brought us here is one of them," he said. A vampire? Kirsteen still couldn't believe what he was saying. "Yes, I know one when I see it. I've spent years running away from them. Still, I don't think he's behind the ship. Him and that girl, they've got something else in mind for us. If they are trying anything, though, don't worry. I've killed more than my fair share of those blood-sucking monsters." The professor and Lindsey, meanwhile, had made their way to the control room. It had been somewhat damaged in the crash, but fortunately, not only could the professor repair it in no time, the ship also had a sort of magical healing factor that would repair any damage automatically anyway, though it might take some time. "You'd think they'd be grateful we pulled them out of that nightmare," the professor said to Lindsey as he adjusted the controls. "To be fair, Professor, we may have been the ones who got them into this awful mess." "Nonsense, Lindsey. You heard them before. They were prisoners on board that ship before I crashed into it. It's strange that we didn't find any pilots when we were searching for the survivors." "Apart from those horrors. God, do I hate zombies. I've never met one I liked, you know. Even vampires and demons can be pleasant, but zombies, they're always bad company," Lindsey joked.
I quite agree, Lindsey, but still there is no way those brutes could build a craft like this. No, this is something else. Once we've gotten those people back to their own time, then I intend to investigate.
The Professor attempted to start his ship, but nothing happened. He heard a strange whirring sound for a few seconds afterwards, before trying the controls again. This time, however, there was a crashing sound, and the whole ship began to shake violently for a few minutes.
Oh, I don't understand. The main unit should have at least repaired itself by now, the Professor said as he opened up the controls.
Just then, a strange noise, like someone groaning in pain, began to echo through the ship. Lindsey checked the communication device. According to this, there's nothing coming through.
Of course not. This noise is poking its way into our very minds, Lindsey. It's a telepathic communication, the Professor said in a worried tone.
The voice began to speak. Please, help me. You are the only ones who can. I was too weak to contact you before now.
Who are you?
The Professor asked. I am Geister. I am the vessel you clumsily crashed into with that bat-shaped excuse for a vessel.
Geister? Of course, I should have known. I'd heard stories about you. A lot of people dismissed you as a legend, but I am slightly more open-minded than most, the Professor said proudly and somewhat arrogantly.
Who is Geister? Lindsey asked.
Geister is a time and space ship made from magic. It was constructed by the Phryxia civilization. They built it to explore all of time and space. Its pilot, however, was killed in an accident, but his soul somehow fused with the engine of the ship. They became an entire entity with aspects of the pilot's personality, the Professor said.
He continued,
The ship still loves its crew. They were its friends, and according to the stories, they all enjoyed travelling through time and space together. When the crew died, Geister would begin abducting other beings from all of time and space to be his new crew. To be fair, some of them were clearly meant to join Geister, but others he abducted because he knew removing them from time wouldn't cause a disturbance, and he ripped them from their lives.
Lindsey had a sudden realization. Oh my God, those zombies! They were his previous crew members! I didn't kill them, the voice protested. They died themselves of old age. Most of them were not happy at being taken at first, but in time most of them came to appreciate the lives I gave them. When they died, I kept their corpses preserved in magic as a sign of respect. You mean they developed Stockholm Syndrome? There's also a huge but, isn't there? Lindsey asked. If my ship was ever breached by an outside menace, then I would bring my old crew back to protect my current crew, the voice said. Both Lindsey and the Professor felt sick at the revelation. I was honouring them, the voice protested. I was giving them a chance to be heroes again after their passing. I was allowing them to save the next generation of champions.
The ones I met didn't seem to see it that way, the Professor said with disdain. Why were they trying to kill your current crew?
That is on your head, vampire. When our vessels collided in the vortex, you ruptured my engine. The magic from my core seeped out and revived the zombies. They're crazed, feral, but they are the least of my problems. In a few hours the rupture will become so great that I will explode. Lindsey could see that the vessel's word had affected Fang. Well, you could have looked where we were going too, she protested. Neither of you are leaving until you repair my core. Your vessel is caught in a trap of my creation that is draining the energy from your core. It'll put off my death by a couple more hours. After that, I'll die, but your vessel will be trapped here, powerless and unable to move. You'll be caught in the blast.
You would do well not to tamper with the core of my ship. It contains something that makes those cadavers of yours look like, well, I'm not sure I should share this with you, but trust me on this, you're biting off more than you can chew, the Professor said.
You leave me with no choice. You must help me, Geister repeated, thinking the professor was all talk. Neither of us intend to help you carry on taking people and defiling their corpses. You're a monster, Lindsey protested.
Sadly, we don't have a choice, I'm afraid. He holds all the cards for now. We need to fix that engine for those people out there. We'll talk about his poor lifestyle choices later. Also, if I'm being fair, we all know how sometimes time can force you to do questionable things, though that doesn't excuse the zombies, Geister, the professor said reluctantly.
You can't be serious, Lindsey asked.
Believe me, I'm repulsed by this needy ship as much as you, but we can't let him tamper with the core of the bat any longer. You know what is at stake if he does.
You will not take my new friends, the voice boomed. This is the best collection I've ever assembled. War heroes, grizzled vampire killers, famous artists, they're mine!
Like I said, we'll discuss that later and see which, if any, can and should be returned. First, let us teleport back to your ship, the professor responded.
I'm afraid not. Whenever you teleport, you use up more energy from your ship, keeping me alive. It's why I was barely able to contact you. I've disabled the teleportation spell.
If you think I'm going to make my way through those zombies, the professor protested.
Like you said, I hold all the cards, Geister replied.
To be continued.